Now, I have always really been fascinated with people's true stories. That's one of the reasons that I became a journalist. When I was in middle school, I read every single biography in the school library, truly, I mean, A to Z. And I loved the way the people, the characters in the books managed to somehow persevere despite all odds, and they go on to invent the first airplane or found the Red Cross. I loved those happy endings. And then I got into the news business, and I learned that it was people's bad news stories that got the most attention. And there's a saying in the news business, if it bleeds, it leads. So as a correspondent for CNN for 18 years, I ended up doing a lot of reports on disasters. Everything from hurricanes and tornadoes and plane crashes to 9/11 and the sniper attacks. And I saw a lot of bad things happen to good people. But I didn't really focus on it too much because I didn't have time. You had to go on to the next story. You couldn't get personally involved. And I never really thought that disaster would ever impact me personally, that it would completely change my life in completely unexpected ways. But that's exactly what happened in August of 2005 when my hometown, that Matthew just mentioned, on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, was ground zero for Hurricane Katrina. And I was there on the Gulf Coast, reporting live as the hurricane roared in. I'd like to first just tell you a little bit about my hometown. When the hurricane hit, it was a tiny little town, population of about 9,000. It's located an hour east of New Orleans. And when we moved there, when I was 12, it was just so wonderful because I'd been a vagabond my whole life up until then. Up to that point, we had lived in 6 different cities in 4 different states. And finally, we stayed put. And finally, I had a place to call home for the very first time. So it was fantastic. And I want to tell you, in Mississippi, on our Gulf Coast, there are no levees. We didn't live below sea level. In fact, our downtown in Bay St. Louis was the highest point in the United States on the entire Gulf of Mexico. The French actually settled Bay St. Louis before they settled New Orleans, because they said, well, what a perfect, safe location, a 28-foot bluff over the water. You can see any enemy ships coming, you're safe from storms. Well, but it was not enough protection from Hurricane Katrina. And we had sustained 125-mile-per-hour winds that day when the hurricane hit on August 29th, 2005. We had gusts of 145, hopscotching tornadoes that jumped all around town, exploding homes and neighborhoods. And then there was the water. We were 28 feet over the water. We had a 30-foot storm surge, and crashing 7-8-foot waves on top of that. They say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, so I'd like to show you just a couple right now. So we can have the first one. This is our downtown, boarded up and ready for the storm, or so we thought. And after. You can see the water now. How about this one? This is a historic turn-of-the-century bed and breakfast in Bay St. Louis before the storm and after. Got a cute little place where you can rent kayaks and bikes before the storm, get a cup of coffee, and have a sandwich. Well, you needed more than a kayak to get through Katrina. And this building at 956 South Beach Boulevard, I know it well. That was the house where I grew up and after. 75% of the homes and businesses in Bay St. Louis that day were heavily damaged or completely destroyed. It was pretty extraordinary to see the extent of the damage. Now, I have to kind of rewind and say, we knew that there was a threat of hurricanes, you know, when I moved there as a kid. And when we moved there, we saw that there were empty lots still up and down the beach when I moved there at the age of 12. It was just a few years after Hurricane Camille had hit in 1969. But I thought, well, you know, they've rebuilt, things will be fine. And I would see these lots up and down the beach, you know, these driveways and stairs up to nothing. And when we would evacuate, and my family did evacuate several times, over the 30-year time span that we owned our home, we evacuated a couple times. And we did, fortunately, my parents sold our home just 2 years before Katrina hit. But my parents would say, you know, take everything that's most important to you in this world and put it in the car. And as we would drive down the driveway, I would look back and I would memorize every detail of our house, because I knew we could come back to stairs and a driveway to nothing, which is just what you saw there. So there was just not much left anywhere in town. And so there I was in the middle of it all, in the middle of the destruction, and my worst childhood nightmare had come true. And people were reaching out to me. My phone started lighting up, and I was getting emails from people all around the country, people who I didn't even know. And they would say, please, please see if you can find my father. My mom and dad, they stayed in the house, or I haven't heard from my brother since he was on the roof and the water was all around him. And can you get over and see what's left of my house? I didn't know where to start. I was overwhelmed. What do you do? Where do you turn? And it was, you know, you just, as you saw that destruction, it was mind-boggling. You basically, your brain did not want to process what your eyes were seeing. I felt like I was on the set of like a disaster movie, and any second the director was going to yell, cut, and the sets would slide back and everything would be okay. Only it wasn't. And I want to step back just for a minute and look at a gospel that both Mark and Luke tell the story of discussion that Jesus had with his disciples about trust and about hope in really difficult times. So therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. Life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than the birds. Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to his life, since you cannot do this very little thing? Why do you worry about the rest? And those are very, very powerful words, but consider how difficult it is to trust and to have faith like that. In the middle of a disaster, when you're not just worrying about food and clothing, but when your house and your workplace and your child's school and the grocery store and the corner gas station and the bank and your church are all gone. So I'd like you just for a moment to imagine. Imagine what that would be like, and turn to the person next to you and talk a little bit about this challenge that Jesus issues to us and how you might respond. And then I'd like you to share with me. So talk amongst yourselves. Just wondering again if a couple of you would like to share some of your thoughts on this challenge. Yes? Hang on, I think we have a microphone. Thank you.
I had asked my husband, because he was a responder there with the Air National Guard, and I asked him, how did you feel when you saw all that firsthand in real life? What did it make you think or feel? And he was saying it was hard to imagine, because he knew he could come back home and he wouldn't have to deal with that. But hearing all those people's stories, you know, how did he didn't know where to begin to even try and help them cope, much less just doing the simple things of issuing food and resources, you know. But I was just wondering, does it get easier when there's a whole group of people versus you just yourself as an individual going through something?
You know what's interesting is, yeah, when everyone loses everything at once,
Yeah.
disaster is the great equalizer. Initially, I think it does, you know, because it's like, okay, well, it becomes a big no-blind zone, because everybody's lost everything at once. You know, who are you to fuss? Everybody's lost everything. But yeah, as time goes on pretty quickly, it's like, okay, now where do we turn? Because we've all lost everything. Any other hands? Anyone? Okay. Well then, oh wait, here we go. We got one back here.
Would have
I
to
know you
be
guys are
white
not
or
as shy.
sauce.
Come on.
We were talking about, I think it's just a part of being in the DC area, that it's very transient, and that I've never felt very tied to one location to where that is, you know, that place is my home and I would really want to stay there. So I think my instinct would be to just go somewhere else.
Just leave.
And just leave and start over. And I think if you've lived in that place for so long and it's so much a part of your identity and who you are, that would be a very different experience.
No, that is true. And I'll tell you, just from the work I do now in the post-disaster world, is that often that is an instinct, and you know, even when you've been tied to a place for a really long time. But it's interesting that, again, in talking to people in disaster-stricken communities all over the country, those who leave are often the ones who have the most difficult emotional and mental recovery. Because you end up somewhere where no one else has gone through that traumatic experience you have. You have no support system. And so on those days when you fall apart, everybody's like, who's that crazy lady crying in the corner, you know? They're not like, okay, yeah, I get it, it's all right. And you tend to feel like a bit of a deserter. So it's interesting that that instinct sometimes to both is not always the best one. Anything else? Oh, one more.
I have nothing to say. I just want to see Matthew come.
He needs his exercise, right?
No, actually, my wife worries way too much, I think. And, well, I know. And it was interesting that the first thing when she said, when I say she worries too much, is I like to plan ahead. And there's a big difference between planning ahead and worrying. And I think it's important for people to understand.
Very true. Very true. Well, the people in Mississippi, they did plan ahead, but it's tough, again, when you get this 30-plus foot wall of water. It kind of washes all that planning out the door. So how do people in Mississippi react to this situation? Well, when they climbed out of the rubble later that day, they were looking for inspiration. And let me tell you, they needed it. And they didn't have to look far. I mean, I'm not saying that these were miracles, but so many symbols of our faith survived. The first one I saw was a statue of Jesus on Highway 90 in Bay St. Louis. And it overlooked, or I should say, used to overlook, that's me in green there, a 2-mile-long bridge that connected our town, 2-mile-long, 4-lane, massive bridge that connected our community to the rest of the Mississippi Gulf Coast. The entire bridge was decimated. Nothing left. Every span gone. There's the highway sign right there, and the statue survived. The next one I saw was at the St. Augustine Retreat Center in Bay St. Louis. Statues survived while trees fell down all around and the building was swept away. This is at St. Clair's in Waveland, the town just to the west of us. St. Clair's is where my brother and sister went to school, and that slab behind the statue in the grotto is where the brick church had been. Brick church was swept away, top of the grotto knocked off. I don't know how Mary wasn't decapitated, go figure. And then this last one really amazed me. It's outside of the rectory at Our Lady of the Gulf Church in Bay St. Louis. As you can see, the storm ripped all the bricks right off the wall of the rectory. And that statue is about this high. And when I saw it Thursday after the storm, I was like, really? Wow. But every time I saw one of these, it was as if God was saying, I am still here in the middle of all this destruction and loss. I am with you. Don't be afraid. And I would think every time what came to mind when I saw one of the statues was Psalm 23:4. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff. They comfort me. And it was a scary time, let me tell you, because we were hearing the same reports that you were of the looting and the violence in New Orleans, the chaos, and people shooting at helicopters. It was terrifying. But in Mississippi, these were smaller communities, they were closer knit, and people knew one another. So what I saw people pulling together. I saw communities that they didn't have anything left, so they opened shelters and they started pooling whatever anyone had, bringing it together, sharing it with one another. Wherever people were after the storm, they would start helping. They would start helping that person clear their lot, move the debris, rescue whoever was trapped in a house. We had no help that came to the city for about a week, and so the city fathers led sanctioned looting. We had looting in town, but it was the mayor and the vice mayor leading it, and they were scavenging through the stores to find whatever food was left to feed the city. A housekeeper, for example, she was one of the lucky ones. Some people only got 3 or 4 feet of water, so she still had a house left, and she had been able to salvage a car, one car, and some of the people who were her clients lived up near the water. Some of them were affluent people in the community, and their houses were entirely gone. They lost everything, didn't even have a vehicle left. And Diane had just bought from one of these families an additional car that she had tucked away in a dry spot, in a high spot in town for her daughter. And her daughter, Cookie, her teenage daughter, and she gave it back to that family. She said, look, you need this more than I do right now. Y'all just keep this for as long as you do. It's all right. So it was fascinating to see housekeepers reaching out. Everybody, again, this is the equalizing factor. Disaster levels everyone. And then volunteers. The volunteers brought so much hope to our community. They came south from the very first day. Many of them from right here in Cedar Ridge. The men's group came down to Bay St. Louis to help, and it was so important because you really felt completely overwhelmed. You felt like an ant trying to move a mountain. When you saw that debris, which I know you saw, it was stretched as far as the eye could see. Where do you even start? You felt like an ant trying to move a mountain, but as the volunteers came down, you realized one ant alone couldn't move a mountain, but together tens of thousands could. And to date, more than 1 million people have poured south to the Mississippi Gulf Coast to help people they never met in towns they never heard of. And then there were signs that, to me, were pretty extraordinary after the storm. Maybe there were some funny ones on debris piles that used to be houses, like dirt cheap waterfront fixer-upper. Yeah? You have to have a sense of humor to survive disaster, let me tell you. The ones that really touched me were signs like this one. That's on a home in Diamond Head. It's a community just to the north of Bay St. Louis. Look, pub, God lives. Or the sign on St. Clair's in Wayland. Katrina was big, but God is bigger. Or this one, this is my favorite. Please don't loot. It's all we have left. God bless. That says it all. That is quintessential Bay St. Louis. Only in Bay St. Louis would they, in addressing looters, the lowest of the low, in my book, would they say, please, be very polite. And then they would conclude their message by saying, God bless. And that was the word that I heard used most often by people up and down the Mississippi Gulf Coast to describe themselves after the storm. Not cursed, but blessed. Blessed. And this by people who had lost everything. But the mantra up and down the Mississippi Gulf Coast became, It's just stuff. It's just stuff. And they learned what really mattered was what sustained them when all the stuff was gone. And that was faith, family, friends, community. That's what got them through. Our mayor had a really wonderful way of describing the situation that the city found itself in. He said, oh, that's him standing in where his house was. We may not have houses, but everyone here has a home. We may have lost everything. We still have each other. And every day, as long as it's a little bit better today than it was yesterday, we're on the right track. Well, in that first year after the storm, I did 2 documentaries on Bay St. Louis for CNN. So I was there in Mississippi more than I was in Maryland that year. And I started getting mad because I saw how entities that were supposed to help people in times of need, the federal government, insurance companies, they were often AWOL. I heard story after story after story after story of people who were not getting compensated for hurricane damage to their home. And these were people who had flood insurance, and they had wind insurance too. And there were businesses that were applying for SBA loans and being turned down because they didn't have collateral to show that they could repay the loans. And they were like, but if you let me rebuild my business, then that will be my collateral and I will repay you. And it was just this vicious circle. And people were suffering from PTSD. And we started having suicides, and people were suffering and in pain. And there was so little that I could do to help. And I started being plagued by feelings of guilt. Especially because that first week after the storm, I hadn't been able to find a missing neighbor. And I had babysat for his 2 daughters when I was a teenager. And instead, his oldest daughter found his body 9 days after the storm, buried in the rubble of his house, face down. And it had been over 100 degrees over those 9 days. I mean, no daughter should have that be the last memory of her father, right? I felt like I had let her down when she needed me most. And people would say, oh, Kathleen, you're our hero. Just because I got these stories on CNN about the town, and the town was getting help, and I felt like a fake. Because anything I did disappeared like a thimble full of help in an ocean of need. And so I started asking that unanswerable question, that you do when things just don't make sense, when it's just not fair. Why? Why? How could a loving God visit such destruction and suffering onto such good, kind, God-fearing people? And not just once, but twice. Hurricane Camille in 1969 and then Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The 2 worst hurricanes to hit the U.S. in modern history, and they hit my hometown. Okay, Bay St. Louis was not Sodom or Gomorrah, and it just didn't make sense to me because I was raised to believe that if you led a good life and if you helped people, that God would reward you, that He wouldn't smite you. Well, I was angry. And so I turned my back on God and said, I'm not talking to you. I'm not talking to you again until I figure this out. But He didn't turn His back on me. And He kept showing me that He was still there. Like 6 months after the storm, when we did a story on Miss Lucy. That's her next to me in white. She was an elementary school janitor in Biloxi, Mississippi. And when we met her, that's standing in what's left of her home. Her home had been gutted by the storm surge. She lived in Point Cadet. Point Cadet is a poor working class neighborhood in Biloxi, Mississippi, surrounded by casinos, and the casinos were quickly rebuilding, but most of the homes in between sat in ruin. And every day, Miss Lucy would come out of her trailer and gather with her friends on what was left of her front porch, and she would thank God. They would all thank God for the blessings He had bestowed upon them, because they were alive and their families were alive. And Miss Lucy, as you can see, she's a petite lady. She was nearly swept away in the storm surge. Biloxi is a peninsula surrounded by water, so the water came in on all sides, and they hadn't evacuated. But luckily, her husband, there behind her, plucked her up out of the water. So she was very thankful. He had fallen ill several months before the storm. He was a seasonal seafood worker. And they were the working poor. They had paid off their home, they had paid off their furniture, they had paid off their car. But when he fell ill, they didn't have enough money to pay for both their homeowner's insurance and his medicine. So they wisely decided to buy his medicine and keep him alive, but because they had let their homeowner's insurance lapse, they did not qualify after the storm for any aid at all. They were considered negligent homeowners. So when we arrived, Miss Lucy was just overjoyed. She started going, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you, Jesus. I knew you would send someone to help me." And my sound man goes, "Kathleen, come here. Someone has to tell Miss Lucy that we are just a TV crew. We are not miracle workers. This story is not going to change her life." And I'm like, "Well, Ron, I hear what you're saying, but all Miss Lucy has left is her faith. We can't take that from her." Miss Lucy was right. Our story aired on Mardi Gras morning, and that morning, a wealthy businessman in Warsaw, Indiana, was jogging on his treadmill. He was a regular Fox viewer, and he's jogging along, and for some reason, he switched channels to CNN, and he saw our report. And he'd been wanting to do something to help the Gulf Coast, but he didn't want to just write out a check. And many years earlier, before he became a successful businessman, Steve Kessler had been a janitor. So he called his wife in the room and he said, "I'm going to help that lady." Well, he reached out and contacted Miss Lucy, and he flew in crews to demolish what was left of her home, to clear and grade the lot. And 1 year after the storm, we were able to report how Miss Lucy and her family had moved into this beautiful new house. Well, Miss Lucy called Steve Kessler the answer to her prayers. She said, "He just came right down and he just went to work. He just like an angel that the Lord sent down to bless me." You know, and as miraculous as that story was, and I could tell you many, many more, I was still ticked off at God. And I was not very happy at work either. And even when, a year later, I was assigned to cover the White House. Hey, it does not get any better than that, right? Walking into the Oval Office, asking the president questions, flying on Air Force One. Okay, that was great. But I didn't want to be there. I really didn't. I wanted to be on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, doing stories about how they were still struggling, important stories. Well, I got my wish. I got caught up in layoffs at CNN in 2008 as the recession began. And so one minute I'm standing on the north lawn of the White House doing my live reports, and the next minute I was out on the street. Wow, it was quite a shock. And no one was hiring. And I didn't turn to God because, well, he and I weren't exactly on speaking terms. But I thought, maybe this was an opportunity for me to write the book that I'd always wanted to, about the Mississippi Gulf Coast recovery and sharing their inspiring story that most Americans had never heard of. And so I started writing. There was a problem, though. All the publishers had determined that Katrina books do not sell well. No matter how well they're written, no matter how compelling the characters are, they don't sell. So every single publisher in New York City turned us down flat. I mean, and we approached dozens of them. So my agent says, well, go think about what else you want to write about. Everyone told me, just quit. And I thought, but if the people of the Mississippi Gulf Coast did not quit in the face of the worst natural disaster in U.S. history, I mean, who am I to quit in the face of a few rejections, right? So I kept writing, and I found myself just on the eve of the 4-year anniversary of the hurricane, back in Bay St. Louis doing interviews for the book anyway, writing away. And I was exhausted because I had just been questioning so much for so long. And I thought maybe it's time to just trust. So I walked into Our Lady of the Gulf Church. That was a church I had attended as a kid there, where 2 of my sisters were married. The storm had destroyed the interior and ripped the roof off the church. And the blue FEMA tarps, if you were down there, you saw the blue tarps on all the roofs. They were too small for our church. So a very creative parishioner, he was able to scavenge up a liquor billboard, vinyl liquor billboard tarp, and we stretched that over the roof of the church. Of course, with the Jim Beam bottle down, of course. Couldn't have helicopters flying over the city and seeing this giant bottle of liquor on top of the church. So I'm sitting there and I start reflecting. No, I had forgotten about what Jesus said in the Gospel of John, that no branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine. You are the branches. And I thought about what my mom had been telling me. Let go and let God. And so I reflected on what I had been through since Hurricane Katrina, and I realized I was stronger, I was more resilient, I was a better person. Just like the people of the Mississippi Gulf Coast, I was blessed. And so at that moment, I put everything in God's hands. And I felt a weight being lifted. I felt at peace for the first time in a long time. And when I left the church that day, I didn't know what was going to happen, but whatever it was, I would accept it. So 3 days later, I was in the airport getting ready to fly back to Maryland, and my phone rang. And it was a publisher in North Carolina asking to see more of my manuscript that I'd sent them. And 9 days later, they offered to publish it. The rest, as they say, is history. Rising from Katrina, won some awards. It made a few little bestsellers lists. And now my life has taken an entirely different direction. I now focus on linking communities after they go through disasters. You here at Cedar Ridge participated in the letter writing campaign a couple of years ago to encourage the survivors of the earthquake and tsunami. Remember that, and we did so much good. And I've now started a nonprofit called Leaders Link. We've just started our first fundraising campaign. Wow, it's going slowly. But we are the first organization to harness and share elected officials, disaster lessons learned to help other communities better prevent, prepare for, and recover from disasters. And Bay St. Louis is doing so well, too. I'm so excited to share that with you. The population has almost recovered back to pre-Katrina levels. And remember that bridge I told you about, the 2-mile-long, 4-lane massive bridge was destroyed? Well, it has been rebuilt and replaced by a gleaming $267 million bridge that now goes high over boat traffic and hopefully high over any future storm surges. Our downtown, our beach road has been rebuilt, and we have parking on both sides of the road now. It used to be a very narrow road before. We have a protective seawall. And that's how it looked in October during cruising the coast. That's when classic car owners from all over the country, thousands of them descend on the Gulf Coast, and they basically do this long motorcade up and down the area. So downtown is coming back. Businesses like this that had just been gutted by the storm have repaired and reopened, and now it houses a fabulous new restaurant. At the foot of Main Street now we have a marina, a beautiful $18 million marina where people can pull up in their boats, and now they can walk up to the downtown area. They could never do that before, and they can shop and try out the wonderful restaurants. Back in 2010, just 5 years after the storm, Bay St. Louis was named by Coastal Living magazine as one of the best little beach towns in America. Just last year, in voting on budgettravel.com, it came in #2 in voting for the coolest small towns in America. So Bay St. Louis turned tragedy into opportunity. It's always so wrong. After the hurricane, when I thought that God had forgotten me, that had forgotten the people of the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And He was there all along. But sometimes you need to lose everything to find your way. You know, it's easy to have faith when things are going well. You know, God is dumping blessings on you by the bucketful. It's very different when the rug has been pulled out from under you. And disasters strip away everything. But in the process, they reveal so much. They reveal who we really are and how much more alike we are than different, and how much we need one another. And it's in those times when hope seems so elusive that we come together, that God brings us together, and we realize we're not alone. We're not. And that we can actually, eventually, come through the despair, come through the destruction and the disaster, and emerge stronger and with deeper faith than ever before. If you would pray with me now. God, sometimes we feel overwhelmed by the situations we find ourselves in. We feel helpless and forgotten. But in the middle of the chaos, you show us that miraculous things can happen if we just believe. Please give us the strength to trust that what seems impossible can actually occur, that you have a plan. It may not be apparent for years, but help us not to give in to despair. Help us find hope in our darkest hour.